You're listening to Magazine Mondays on the Banner podcast, where each week we bring you a reading from the magazine archive for your encouragement and edification. I do realise that I often say this, but something a little different for you this Monday on the Banner podcast. In July 1993, the 358th issue of the magazine appeared an article entitled "The Pastor and His Health, Number 1" by Brian Beardsworth. This was a transcription of notes from Dr Beardsworth from an address which he'd given at the Ministers Conference in Leicester the year before, 1992. Now, I was asked to read this on the podcast. However, having a look, while very much worth reading, I felt it might be better if we heard the substance from Dr. Beardsworth himself. Now, before we listen to the audio, I just want to mention a few biographical particulars which have been related by our now former general manager, John Rawlinson. Dr. Beardsworth was a doctor with a great heart for pastoral ministry. For many years, he attended the ministers' conferences in Leicester as a sort of resident doctor. Born in 1928, he was a doctor in Hinckley, Leicestershire, between 1958 and 1998, and he went to glory in April of 2020. John Rawlinson and a great many others connected by the Banner remember Dr. Beardsworth with great fondness. One of the anecdotes John relates is that Dr. Beardsworth would often be asked in his days as a medical lecturer which area of medicine doctors should specialize in. And his typical advice was to suggest skin, because everybody has skin. Things often go wrong with skin, and they are very rarely fatal. Let me read for you a touching obituary from Roger and Marion Abbott, who are not known to me, but who remember this about Dr. Beardsworth. Doc B, as he was known affectionately by Marion and I, and by the young church members we pastored in the 1980s in Loughborough, was hugely loved and highly respected. At a time when our emerging membership was mostly well under 30 years of age, he brought wise, mature balance and enormous encouragement to bear on the infant work in his frequent visits to us for Sunday morning ministry. Everyone looked forward to Doc B's visits and ministry. He could combine a family GP's careful analysis of issues with a gentle preaching manner that meant, however serious the biblical message, our hearts were the more willing to receive it. Whether it was while we met in our home in the very early years, or in our own church premises from 1985, he cut the same figure. Leaning on the lectern, a man with a shock of hair, half-rimmed spectacles, through, but mostly over which he would look and smile at us. He would bring serious truths from the Bible to bear upon us. In short, we loved him, especially for that infectious laugh of his. So then, let's listen to this address from the 1992 Leicester Ministers Conference on the pastor and his health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Marshall. It's quite warm here. I wondered whether to do a William Gadsby and take my coat off, but I think I'll keep it on at the moment. Well, I must first of all, of course, express not only my thanks to Mr. Marshall, but also to Mr. Murray for this kind invitation to address you this evening on the subject of the pastor and his health. It's a rare privilege, if not unique, for someone not in the full-time ministry to receive and to be given such an opportunity. I have, incidentally, an additional reason to thank Mr. Murray, not altogether unconnected with the subject of health. People come into the surgery, especially older people, and they say, "Doctor, I can't lose any weight. Have you got any advice?" And when I've run out of ideas, I say, well, there's one thing that always works. I say, find something to worry about. I see you beginning to get the point. I was delighted to get on the scales this week and find I'm down to 10 stone. It certainly proved my thesis. I think I could get into my wedding suit. My wife has threatened me if I accept any more of these invitations. She said I kick her in bed every night now in my sleep. Well, we're amusing, but of course it's a very difficult subject, I'm sure, that you'll all understand. That to try and deal in whatever time we have, I've got enough here to speak till tomorrow morning, that it's impossible really to do justice to a subject as diverse and as so enormous in scope as the whole question of health. I've had to be very selective, therefore, in the topics I'm discussing, and I've tended really to hold out as the criteria the needs of the younger men. I've already commented to one this evening. If the older ones don't know some of these essential principles now, it's a bit late. I've concentrated then on the younger men, and I hope to say something which might be essentially of practical help. Well, the credentials such as I have, and they're pretty limited, I wonder why I'm here really. I come from my occupation, you've already heard that's of a general practitioner, and the advantage of that, it not only gives quite an experience of specific illnesses, but in addition, a rare opportunity of studying human nature in all its diversity. And in addition tonight, apart from my own observations, I'm going to be calling on the observations of two very famous preachers. From the last century, Mr. Spurgeon, I felt it was particularly appropriate in this centenary year to remind you of some of the wise, homely, down-to-earth, practical common sense of that man. He was a genius, of course, in many respects. And who more personally familiar with health and all its problems, his gout and his depression. He really went through it. And of course, in this century, Dr. Lloyd Jones, a man I'm sure that you all know through his writings, and many personally through contact with him over the years. I know many of you, because you've told me, have had counselling and advice and help on a personal level from him in previous days. Everybody still knows of him, of course, as the doctor, as though there were only one. He was always very friendly with fellow doctors. He had this kind of relationship with them, I think in some ways, closer than he had with many ministers. He used to say all sorts of very interesting things to us. About the ministers too, yeah. Well, the first obvious question is to ask why we're studying health. I wonder if some of the younger ones perhaps would come and say, what? It's a waste of time, this health business. We know all about health. Or probably we're not the least bit interested in it. And I feel that we could argue, of course, that it does fulfill a very necessary balance, a balance which is present in Scriptures, between the message and the messenger. I mean, the apostle reminds Timothy that he not only has to take heed to the doctrine, but he's got to take heed to himself. And though obviously that's essentially, I think in the first instance, a spiritual thing, his relationship to the truth, nevertheless he goes on, doesn't he, in that epistle to talk about practical health problems. And there can be no question that a knowledge of ourselves in every respect must be of help. There's a great need to give attention, I feel, to anything and everything which can influence this great work to which a pastor is called. The grace of God, marvelous. It doesn't come down from heaven in a vacuum. It comes through what, of course, are described as earthen vessels, frail men. But, of course, in addition to that, there's a much more pressing practical problem, and that is the fact that these days there are an increasing number of breakdowns in health amongst men in the ministry. There's still young men leaving the ministry after quite a short time. Oh, of course, there's always been, as it were, a dropout out of all professions, but it's still happening. in the ministry of quite young men, they become quickly disillusioned with their experience of pastors, as pastors. Of course, there are very obvious reasons for that. Men come in really knowing very little about what is involved. If I said to you older ones, those at least who weren't brought up in the manse, has the ministry turned out to be what you thought it was going to be when you were young? I'm sure you'd all say, nothing like it really. I can remember an older minister telling me, he came to a conference like this, sat opposite a young man, never met him before, in a moment or two, this man was saying to him, "Do you preach the doctrines of grace?" My friend was taken back a bit. But you see, the inference was, well, that's all really that the ministry consists of. Do that, it solves all your problems. Well, of course, we know that that just isn't true. There are all kinds of things that the young, inexperienced man meets, trials. He starts, if you like, with an idealistic and an unrealistic, often, view of the ministry. There's an appearance about it, a glamour about it, isn't there, of the whole position. There are all sorts of natural attractions. Oh, I know it's not, in a sense, what it used to be in terms of the public recognition of the ministry, but there's still a position there. You stand at the front, you do all these other things. And these young men rarely realize. They go into the ministry, they have that so-called honeymoon period when everything goes well, and then the criticisms. Well, perhaps his preaching isn't quite as good as the old pastor, and so he goes. I don't need to enlarge on that, you know what I mean. And they can't stand up to it, and they fall out of it. A minister's wife said to me just recently, no connection with this particular conference, and she said, the thing that strikes me about my husband's work, and he's always making comments about it, he says, you know, the things I've got to do, I didn't come into the ministry to do these things. But they seem to be so many things are part of the modern ministry which are unconnected with preaching, and I've got to do them. And they seem to be occupying all my time. In fact, this same lady said, she said, you know, some of the younger men, they're so occupied with various things. She said, I do believe that their devotions are largely carried out in the public meetings. And that's the sort of thing that happens. Men come then unprepared for the problems, unaware of the difficulties, and they leave. But in addition, and this is really in a sense a much more important thing, because I said there is always in a sense some who find that they've made a mistake. Recently, I'm not aware of how many of you know this, but there was a conference, the BEC conference in Cardiff. One session was devoted to the role of stress in the ministry. They had a consultant psychiatrist, a Christian, Brian Harris, and he reported recently that he was seeing more and more ministers, especially the older ones, that were breaking down under the strain being reported to him, not to mention the ill health among their wives and their families. And probably these things are but the tip of an iceberg for every man who's prepared with all the consequences and the guilt feelings and so on of going to see a psychiatrist, even a Christian. How many more are being dealt with perhaps by the general practitioners? And how many more are just putting up with it? Just being, as it were, soldiering on, feeling weary and discouraged. So that really is the problem. The increasing sense that the stresses, of course, lots of these stresses are common to men, natural men, all professional men, but the particular strains of the ministry. And the first important point that I want to make this evening, and it's addressed to the younger men, is the fact that many of you here who are feeling now, there are some men like that, you know, they just crack up. They've not got a lot in them, as it were. They're very susceptible to strain and stress. It's not going to happen to me. Now, I want to tell you that you have to be very careful at that point. The effects of these, there's no such a person, you see, who doesn't feel these effects and is not going to be affected by them. They used to do the same in the war. The night fighters, they did so many nights, then stop. Why? Well, because any of them, if they keep on long enough with strain of any sort, will actually crack up. And one of my common experiences as a general practitioner is a man who comes in, perhaps an older man, and he may have had some sort of anxiety, depressive illness, or what you call a breakdown. He perhaps has a few weeks or even months off work, and he sits there and he says to me, you know, this is a judgment on me. I say, what do you mean, a judgment? He said, well, there is nobody more unsympathetic to the idea of nerves and so on. Oh, breakdown, that's one luxury I can't afford. You know, those kind of views that people have. That it happens to others, it's not going to happen to me, and they say, I would never have believed it, that such a thing could come to me. Now, of course, if we don't know anything about that from a medical standpoint, we ought to do so from a theological standpoint, and of course, we're reminded of men like Peter in the New Testament, but the classical example surely is Elijah. I'm not going to preach to you this evening, but it seems to me that this man does represent that very significant and singular warning that no man is inviolable. I mean, what an illustration of the reality of the problem than this man. Look at him at Carmel. I mean, natural qualities, spiritual qualities, surely nothing can upset this man. He's held out, isn't he, in James as an example of faith. Men of, you know, that here he is, a men of like passions with you, and yet by means of faith, what he's able to do. But not only in terms of spiritual faith, the kind of courage and authority and control that he showed. Master of the situation. Tremendous irony with which he turns on those false prophets. Could there be any more secure man than Elijah? And yet within 24 hours, what a change. The man who can stand up to 400 men falls before one woman, as it were. And we find him saying what many a minister says today, and some here have said it. Lord, I've had enough. I just can't go on. And if they haven't said it, they've thought it. And many could testify of that. I just can't keep going. Of course, the reasons are very different from one case to another. Sometimes it's personal. Sometimes it's disasters in the church. We know of such a thing, don't we, naturally? We talk about a man, the last straw does the trick. And it's a sad reminder that the best of men are only men at their best. But what really interests me from this standpoint about the story of Elijah is the various explanations and reasons that are given for this by different people. Arthur Pink's Elijah, a book I greatly enjoyed when it first came out. If you haven't read it, it is really, Pink at his most reflective. He really dwells entirely on the spiritual. What was the trouble with Elijah? Well, he took his eye off the living God and looked at the furious woman. That's his explanation. Not only that, of course, he was lifted up by pride and self-confidence. Like Samson, I will arise as at former times. And there was no faith. Faith was replaced by self-reliance. Now, on the other hand, the doctor took a totally different view. Not that he would necessarily disagree with that. He said, you know what the trouble with Elijah was? He was just physically and emotionally exhausted. Look at the excitement on Carmel. Could there be anything like it? Not only that, he ran 18 miles in the pouring rain. I mean, that would kill many a marathon runner. And the doctor, of course, drew the reality of his explanation for the fact that, well, what did the Lord do? Well, he didn't tell him off. He said, what you need is a rest and a sleep. And he repeated that, of course. He didn't deal with his spiritual problem, which was definitely there. He didn't deal with that till afterwards. So you see, here's two men. I think Spurgeon has another explanation. He says when a man has an emotional high like that, the Lord's got to deal with him. Paul says it, doesn't he? I know how to be exalted. Yes, there's always got to be a certain abasing to follow that. Otherwise, a man is going to be lifted up much too much. So there's a spiritual side, there's a natural side. And when a man is low, in any sense, he is vulnerable. It's when he's tired and low and exhausted that these things tend to happen. He panicked. Yes, these things, tiredness, emotional, excitement, these things do affect men. I liked that reference of Mr. Murray's in the magazine about Spurgeon's sermon at the Crystal Palace, on the occasion of the Indian Mutiny. Takes place at Wednesday lunchtime. He goes to bed till Friday morning. Well, you can't go on, you see, with that kind of pressure. And of course, as I say, the Lord treated Elijah by dealing with the food, the physical side, before he came on to the spiritual. So the lessons there are clear. These things can happen to anyone. Some of the reasons are natural, as we shall see. Some are spiritual. And sometimes it needs the wisdom of Solomon looking at the situation. That's why men have got to be very careful how they judge other men. What's the cause? Who knows? I say Solomon would be needed to unravel. Well, I trust I've said enough on that particular point to illustrate this fact that these things can happen. Well, we must hurry up to the whole question. What is health? What is health? Well, the dictionary definition is this. It's a state of being bodily and mentally vigorous. I don't know how many healthy people there are here today. You see the television adverts for these dog foods, the dogs always jumping. But I like the other aspect that's emphasized by the dictionary, and free from disease. It's positive, you see, and negative. Bodily, the Greek definition, a healthy mind and a healthy body. But not only that, it's a freedom from disease. And the striking thing about health is this. Like many other things in life, it's something which, when we possess it, we're entirely unconscious of it. And that's the importance, you see, of that negative, free from disease. You don't notice a good digestion. You only notice indigestion. In other words, this is very important, really. This negative, because disease means contrary, if you like, contrary to ease. So, in considering how to present the whole subject of health to you, it seemed to me the way to do so was in this way, to say that we can define health, if you like, as a state in which we're at ease in every part of our composite natures, mind, physically, emotionally, spiritually. We're healthy when we're at ease, when, as it were, nothing is troubling us. We come in here and think, it's hot in here. Physically, we're not at ease. Or something's going around our mind, we're thinking, I wonder if I leave the lights on the car. once these things come to us, you see, we're, as it were, under the influence of a dis-ease condition. And of course, as human beings, we're made up of these several parts, and we can never think of them in isolation because they all impinge on one another, don't they? The mental and the physical and so on. But as we do in theology, we sometimes isolate things which we know are related in order to look at them individually and specifically. And I want to do that tonight on these different aspects of the human personality, and to realize that problems in every realm can affect our health. So we're going to look at these individual spheres and see where we may get into trouble. Well, of course, we've got to start with the physical. The physical aspects of health. What a tremendous variation there is. Some men, they seem strong as oxes. Nothing ever happens to them. They never get a cold. Other men, they're dogged by constitutional frailty from the word go. Spurgeon was an illustration, wasn't he? And the question is, what attitude should we have to these things? Well, fortunately, I can tell you, first of all, the doctor's attitude. And I think you'll find this quite interesting. It appears in a sermon that he preached during the last war at Westminster Chapel. It had a particular reason. It was prompted by problems, pastoral problems that were happening. And what was happening was this: the bombs were falling. People were in a certain amount of imminent danger. And of course, they would come to him and say, you know, I'm very worried. The siren goes, for example, just hearing the siren. And they say, I start to shake. I start to tremble. And I think to myself, I can't be a Christian. I'm supposed to believe that all will be well. Well, what am I shaking for? One woman told an interesting story. I must be careful digressing too far here because we're only just beginning, really. He said, you got your pajamas with you, I had. He said this woman was saying, you know, the siren went, so he said, I'm going down. Shall I go down into the, underneath the house? They used to have these shelters. And she said, shall I go to... So she said, I got halfway down the shelter and I looked out the window, and there next door, the man's not a Christian, he's in the garden. He's digging. The sirens are going, the bomb is going over. He just leans on his bed, he gets his pipe out and he's lighting his and she says, I think to myself, look, he's a Christian, he's not worrying, look at me, I'm shaking. The doctor incidentally said to her, listen, next time that happens, he says, you get down those stairs as quick as you can. If that man's there, shout out of the window, get in, you silly fool. But that actually was not the point. I'm sorry. He didn't say that from the pulpit, I might have. He had a text I'm going to come to in a moment to illustrate some of these things. And that text was this: take a little wine for your stomach's sake. Sounds strange. He never mentioned alcohol once. But he used it to demonstrate the spiritual principles involved, the difference between faith, between natural things and spiritual things, between faith and fatalism and all these other things. And when he, got through his 3 or 4 propositions, he said, I can summarize it, he said, by telling you an incident that happened to me. And he said he was somewhere or other preaching, and of course, as was his work, at the end of the service, he went down into the vestry. And he said, as was my custom, I began to get dressed up. Well, those of you who know him will know what getting dressed up means. There's a couple of double knit pullovers and a scarf or two and a couple of Melton overcoats and his black hat, you see. And of course, this church officer, seeing this, I don't know whether it was amazement or amusement was the thing that came over the man, but what he said was this. Doctor, he said, it's so interesting. You seem to be careless about your life, but very careful about your health. And, he said, that's it. What did he mean? Well, of course, he was comparing the Christian's attitude and the attitude of the man of the world. The man of the world is very careful about both his life and his health. That's why there's such a craze on health, diet, all these other things. Why? Well, he's only got one life, and he's discovered that if you want to enjoy the pleasures of sin, you do so better if you're healthy. Now, the Christian, of course, is totally different. He's governed by something else. And his attitude towards life, in a spiritual sense, he is careless. What do I mean? He doesn't need to be concerned. He's in the hands of God, and God has given him this life. If you like, we are immortal till our work is done. He knows that. He believes that. Faith hangs on to that. The sovereignty and the certainty of God. But like all things, it's got to be held in balance. That doesn't mean to say that he's irresponsible in relation to his health. Or careless about his life. Careful about your health. It's God's gift. You've got to maintain it. And of course he did in his illness. He might not perhaps have agreed with all the treatment, but he made up his mind, I'll put myself into the hands of the doctors. I'll give them, let them do to me what they do to anybody else. So he said, we've got to be careful about our health to the very last. It's been given to us by God as a charge. And so we must look after it. That was his great emphasis, wasn't it? Balance. Balance these things. He used to talk about the knife edge. The Christian life is a knife edge, he said. And I believe he was emphasizing two things. One, the difficulty, and the other, the intrinsic characteristic, I think, which is in us all. The tendency both to go to one side and another. It's not only true of health, it's true of theology. We go from faith to works and so on. We can never seem to get these things in a good balance. But the Christian must do. He must be careless of his life, but careful and responsible in terms of his health. And that applies to so many realms. I mean, when you leave here, it's no good driving down 90 miles an hour down the motorway and saying, well, I'm in the hands of God. That responsibility and discipline has got to characterize every aspect of the Christian life. They tell me in America, the Roman Catholics, the St. Christophers, they have them on the front of their cars, and they tell me the most sophisticated, when you exceed the speed limit, a voice comes out and says, you're on your own now. That may be coming over here later, I suspect. But you see, you might not agree with the theology, but the practice is good. It's sound, isn't it, and sensible to remember these things. We've got to live under these conditions. And I've got to ask you, what is your attitude to health tonight? Do you ever think about it? Young people, they don't think. The average British man, it's a kind of ostrich philosophy to health. I'm all right, nothing's ever happening to me. You don't need to look about it. Most of us, if you like, have no interest in it. It's a boring subject. Doctors find health ever so boring. It's only politicians that are interested in health. We used to be told, it's an aphorism, isn't it? It comes in the New Testament, they that are whole need not the physician. Nowadays we spend more time looking after the healthy in order that they might not be ill. Well, common sense dictates, doesn't it? And I put it to you, I'm not going to ask for hands up. Who has been for a health check? You see, it's so easy today. There's no excuse. The government have actually sponsored this. The doctors are advertising it. We've got to send out messages every 3 years to tell you to come. Everybody should have a health check. It's simple. Might be the doctor, might be the nurse. They go through some pretty standard things. Blood pressure, urine. A review of the family history. Tremendously important, All this talk about cholesterol, blood pressure and all these other things. We are told quite rightly, it's not got to be indiscriminate. We've got to target the high-risk groups. And if your parents died of heart problems, strokes, blood pressure, you ought really to know if you come in that group. Oh, I know some men are over-concerned about their health. The biggest hypochondriac I've ever met was a doctor, incidentally. Most of us will know a little bit about our family history, and if there's a strong family history of depression, that's very relevant. What about diet and exercise? Well, of course, there's a modern preoccupation. You might call it a craze on this whole question. Every time you turn the television, there's some president or politician jogging somewhere, isn't there? Well, we've got to be careful that we don't react too negatively to that. We've got to have a sensible diet. What we had tonight was just what we shouldn't be eating. The ideal diet, I mean, we should thank them, of course. Because, you know, the scripture says that you eat what is set before you, you know, asking no questions for conscience sake. But we do know that the general principles of sensible eating, the fibre revolution describes it, doesn't it? And there's a lot of medical evidence for this, the high fibre diet. High fibre, low fat, low sugar. We all eat too much. And Grandma's comments when she used to say, when you could eat a bit more, that's the time to stop. That's very sound advice, really. There's nothing more mentally tiring in a sense than, nothing makes a man more sluggish than overeating. It's interesting, you know, in those records of the monastic life, you know, when men used to do a lot of fasting, they used to talk of wonderful spiritual clarity and so on. And almost certainly what they were describing was a natural phenomena. That is, when people are fasting or when they're eating very little, the mind does seem to be very much more clear. And I think you'll find that. I'm sure that we ought really to be very careful about the whole problem of eating. What about exercise? Well, there's nothing more sedentary in a sense than the minister's occupation, is it? Gone are the days when you could ride round Cambridge like Simeon on his horse. Didn't see many horses in the car park tonight, you see. We all ride everywhere. We sit everywhere. And the apostle tells Timothy quite rightly that physical exercise is profitable in the short term, and it's definitely beneficial. And I think we're beginning to realize this more and more. It's very helpful for anyone that can do it, not only physically, but mentally. They say medically that you should exercise every day to a certain state so that you really get your heart beating, at least for a short time, consciously. And we're appreciating more and more. And there's a greater emphasis on walking, swimming, even jogging. Well, of course, some men, and we had a missionary once, he lived in a city, he was extremely busy, there was nowhere to go. I said, get an exercise bike. And he said to me, I lost 2 stone, and I found it so helpful in my mental work. And I'm sure that's right, and I'm sure we've got to be very careful. But of course, the danger, the problem, to some now it's mandatory. It's not just mandatory, but they have a whole theology about it. It's God glorifying, you see. To have a fit, you know, the television pictures of the lean, tan, muscular evangelist, glorifying to God. Well, I mean, the scripture tells us that it's our good works, not our good looks, that are glorifying to God. And I mean, I think these things can get totally out of balance. In fact, I'm always disturbed when any men start talking about the image. You've got it wrong when you're talking about the image. It's politicians that are concerned about images. We're concerned about reality and being natural. You've only got to think of Spurgeon and Lloyd Jones. They're scarcely the sporting, athletic figures that would appear on the television. I really must tell you this little tale about the Westminster Fellowship. The matter came up once, when he was chairing the Westminster Fellowship, about what should you do, exercise, exercise, excellent. And of course, one man in particular was waxing very enthusiastic about this. Yes, he was telling us which roads he ran down and so on. And of course, the doctor was getting more and more disturbed about this. And when they'd finished, he just finished the whole thing by saying, "That would kill me." What, of course, he was emphasizing was this. You've got to allow for individual variation. There's no such thing as a sort of rule that applies to everybody. You've got to make allowances. What suits one, it's self-knowledge again. Keep coming back to this aspect of self-knowledge. What about sleep? Well, great variation in sleep. Some men say, I didn't get 8 hours. And others say, I can't preach on Sunday. The kids were keeping me awake all night. The medical evidence is this, that we don't need as much sleep as we think we need. And the other interesting fact is this, they always tell us that the adverse effect of sleep loss is more on the anxiety element of what it's going to do to, I haven't had my sleep, but so-and-so. It really won't do us nearly the harm that we think it will. Of course, chronic sleep loss will. But it is basically anxiety over sleep. Older men, of course, need less sleep at a time, but more periods, more rest in the day. And certainly sleep disturbance, especially if it goes on, invariably is an early warning sign of mental or emotional disturbance. I really got to make, if we have time, a real thing about serious depression as an illness. I've seen it in many men. And nowadays it's so treatable that it's tragic when it's missed and when they're given the wrong advice. You've got to find what suits you. If you find you need to sleep on Sunday afternoon in order to be fresh for Sunday evening, well, don't have any conscience about it. Just do it. Preaching takes more out of a man than almost anything else. Sometimes only sleep is restorative, but it's discipline. You see, I'm sure half the young men here, they're up half the night talking to one another, aren't they? Well, that's forgivable, it's understandable. But it mustn't become habitual. You must have discipline. I mean, when they put, match of the day on at midnight or something, you've just got to say that I've got to have discipline. What about smoking? Spurgeon loved his cigars, didn't he? But I don't think he would have today, because the facts are that 75% of people who smoke are going to die prematurely, directly or indirectly, as a result of smoking. That's just a medical fact. When you go to the postgraduate education courses that we all have to attend now, this is what they say to us. They say, if you can stop a person smoking in that one act, you will do more for them than everything else you're going to do in the whole of your medical career for that patient. That's how important. It's not just cancer of the lung, bronchitis. It's heart disease. It's all these things. We know this now. We didn't know it. Some of us, of course, came into the Christian life as smokers, and there are some. I've known some very good spiritual men who had awful problems with the question of smoking. But there it is. The effect of illness, of course, is a big subject. I can scarcely go into it, but I've got to just give you a couple of quotations from Spurgeon. And who knew more about this? I wonder how many of you realise that he lost 7 of the last 20 years of his ministry through illness. He was out of the pulpit 7 out of 20. A third of his ministry was lost through illness. Listen to what he says. This is a quotation. In the matter of faith healing, it's very contemporary this, health is set before us as if it were the great thing to be desired above all things. Now that's contemporary if anything is. And then he adds, and this is his question, is it so? I venture to say that the greatest earthly blessing that God can give to any one of us is health, then he adds, with the exception of sickness. I mean, that's incredible, isn't it? That's Spurgeon's experience. With the exception of sickness. Sickness has frequently been of more use to the saints than health has. Sick wife, newly made grave, poverty, sinking of spirit. They teach us lessons nowhere else to be learnt so well. They drive us to the realities of religion. Have you thought of that? That's the relationship, if you like, of health. Furthermore, Spurgeon understood that sickness was used by God to give him understanding and sympathy with others. When a man's gone through, sympathy means fellow feeling. And when a man's been through these things, he's got a certain authority and reality in his pastoral ministry. And exactly the same, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 passage, when he says about the man that's been lifted up into the third heaven, he goes on to speak of his thorn in the flesh, and he shows that God providentially, by means of illness, gave him a deeper self-knowledge into that pride with which all of us have got to be constantly struggling. How did he get that self-knowledge? That self-knowledge really only comes from the Holy Spirit applying his providential dealings with us. So if you like, his health problem led to his self-knowledge. He prayed about it. Well, it's quite all right, pray about the thorn in the flesh. But God's not automatically going to take it away. And he sometimes gets us to see. And of course, that glorious conclusion that Paul came, I will gladly welcome anything that results in my knowing the power of Christ with me. What a tremendous reorientation of thinking in relation to health this spiritual dimension brings. Totally unknown to the world. A real evidence of the spiritual mind. You hear these things, don't you? It's never God's will that you should be ill. All these nonsense on health and prosperity. They're so contrary to the experience of these great men. A minister said to me recently, I see now one of my great problems has been my excellent health over the years. I said, what's the problem? Well, he said, it creates an almost unconscious self-sufficiency and a lack of a sense of dependence on God. Could you believe that? This is what the man said. I can't help wondering if a sense of the uncertainty and brevity of life in previous ages weren't real factors in the urgency and consecration of men like Martin and Brainerd and McChain. They knew that they literally could be here today and gone tomorrow. And this medical revolution whereby, we all think, what's the life expectancy? Well, there's no need to hurry, but there's plenty of time yet. These things militate against faith. Well, that's the physical aspect. It's boring, I'm sorry. We come down now to something much more important, the mental aspect of the health of the pastor. Spurgeon used to say there's tools to every trade, and if there's a tool for the minister's trade, it's the mind. It's the mind that he has to use. And the greatest danger, like all tools, is letting them get blunt or rusty. That's why Paul exhorts Timothy in that 4th chapter, the 1st epistle, give attention, listen to reading, doctrine, meditation, give yourself, continue. And that's all mental work. There's nothing I can look at these things objectively, see, because I'm not in the ministry. I just see what ministers have got to go through. And I think, well, in medicine, the longer you are, the easier it is. You get to know the people. Diseases don't change all that much. So it gets easier. In the ministry, it gets harder. Lord Jones once said, when I first started, he said, I used to get for sermons given. He said, as time goes by, I work harder and harder. Interesting, isn't it? Totally different. There's that almost artificial aspect, the very unusual aspect of the ministry generally. There's no job description for a minister, is there? There is for almost every other job. What's your work? Well, it's spiritual work. You can't assess it. It's lonely work in the study. And it's wearying in a way that physical work isn't. And it needs discipline. It's so much easier to think, I'll go and visit so-and-so. And the doctor said that too on previous occasions. It's so much more difficult to spend time alone with God than it is to go out and do other things. And you see, all types, all personalities go into the ministry, and some love to mix, and it's a real problem and a struggle for them. It's lonely work, I say. But not only that, they've got to produce original work constantly. They've got to try and maintain freshness for the benefit of the people. They've got to bring things old and new. And it's the relentless pressure. And it's against the clock. There's nothing worse than against the clock. And the other day I thought, well, I haven't got halfway through preparation. When you're working against the clock, what a problem it is. It gets you really going, doesn't it? You've got deadlines, and especially when a man's been in a long ministry, the difficulty of sharing things. You know, we all need to discuss things with others. Iron sharpens iron, doesn't it? And some men, you see, after the problems of the church, they go back into their study, and these problems are going round and round. People say to me, you see, they say, it's all right for you, doctor, on Monday you can go back to the surgery. Well, all these people are coming. Your mind gets a bit of relief, but ours doesn't. It's always the work and the people and the problems. And these things keep going on round and round. And of course, when a man's like this and can't share with anybody, things get out of proportion. Some men, of course, fall into the trap of being too busy for fellowship with others, or they undervalue it. Others long for it, but they're too isolated. They don't have any opportunity. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, we know it. You're telling us, you're preaching to the converted. Well, I know that you know it, but I'm just saying, do you realize this? You know, there's a great difference between knowing and realizing. If you study the life expectancy levels for professional people, who are at the bottom? Doctors. That's a fact. Incidentally, ministers are at the top. There's almost a sense of incongruity of me lecturing you. I shall have to get the BMA next year to come here and get some ministers to talk to them about health. This is the thing, you see. The doctors know all about health, but what are they doing about it? Well, they're doing what many ministers are. They just go, well, this is the job. So you just go on, and you don't realise these things wear a man down. I've heard a psychiatrist, a non-Christian psychiatrist, when all the aspects and the stresses of the ministry, the ordinary ministerial life, were explained to him, he said, that's a recipe for breakdown. I can't think how men can stand that. Because, you see, we're still only on the physical, and the minute we haven't come to the biggest one, the emotional strains, and they take a tremendous effect upon a man. And the important thing to say, we're not talking about spiritual things, really. We're talking about natural things, the effect on the mind. It applies to all professions. The biggest cause of breakdowns in all professions is chronic mental overwork, driving yourselves. You know, the psychologists talk about the type A personality, the empire builder, the whiz kid. You get them in the ministry as well, you see. Now, you do need men of drive and of action. But if you're not careful, they get this awful condition, and it's a real condition. We use the phrase burnout, or they do, the Americans are very but it's a reality. And the causes are often purely natural. They're not spiritual. How essential in the practical sense is it for a man to know his limitations? If he's not careful, he just takes on too many things. He suddenly looks at his diary, I didn't realise I've got this and that. I'm never going to have time to prepare. That's a recipe for panic and for chronic fatigue and exhaustion. We've got to learn from experience what we can do. By all means, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. But do have a realistic view of what you can do. I had an experience with a man once, a businessman. He was going into hospital, And I said to him very foolishly, well, how are they going to manage without you? And he said something, and I'm not sure it shouldn't be on the walls of the study of many ministers, because it's a bit of real natural wisdom. He said, I realised long ago, the cemetery's full of those that were indispensable. And it's true, isn't it? It's what happened to Elijah. I'm the only one, Lord. You're not. You think you are. Now, we ought to be conscious of our responsibilities and our opportunities and all these other things. But we've also got to realise our limitations. Even Spurgeon, I say, had to accept these things. And the important thing in view of these things is to realise our need for mental relaxation. This is the old tool again needing sharpening. And it's got to be there. The analogy of the mind to the weapon that needs sharpening, needs a change and a rest. You've got to have it to retain vigour, and without it a man gets weary and dull to himself and his congregation. How does he find relaxation? That's the question. It's different for every man. There's no universal answer. All are different. Some find it physically, the mind and the body, they're interrelated, exercise, sport. Others, the cerebral, they do a bit more reading. Spurgeon, you see, could do all these things and bring them into his ministry. Illustrations and allusions. It's not wasted time, it's needful time. And I'm stressing this, you see. You don't realise the strain, but just think of it and think, what am I going to do? The doctor once told his method. He said, you know how I get mental relaxation? Oh, this is going to be good, they thought. He said, well, what I do, he said, I take the car out and I drive through central London. But that wasn't all. While they were staggering back at this news, he said, but there's one very important thing. You must wait for the rush hour. I used to wonder how often he just said these things just to cause everybody to think. I think he was agent provocateur or something. You see, when he was emphasising this, whatever helps you, well, do it, find it. Don't forget the day off, insist on it. Listen to your wife occasionally. You know the doctor's comments, and this is good. He said, no man can sustain a spiritual ministry without divine help. However great his natural ability, it will crush him. And Spurgeon says this, all mental work tends to weary and depress, but ours is more than mental work, it's heart work, the labour of our inmost souls. How often on Lord's Day evenings do we feel as if life were completely washed out of us? After pouring out our souls over the congregation, we feel like empty pitchers which a child may break. That's real experience. But after the physical and mental, there's the place of the emotional life in the health of the pastor. You see, most of us suffer, don't we, from diseases of feelings. The patients come in, what's the matter? I don't feel well. And it's feelings that cause this thing that we were talking about, this dis-ease, this ill-at-ease. I don't feel well. And in general, we must realise that handling our feelings is the most difficult and the most essential thing we have to learn in the Christian life. Feelings, you see, are the end product of so many variables, often undiagnosable factors. They're beyond our control. You can say to yourself, tomorrow morning I'm going to wake up feeling well. But you either do or you don't, and there's not much you can do about it. We can't produce them. They come from physical factors, temperamental factors. Some men are cheerful, some are gloomy and pessimistic, some are steady and even, others are up and down. But either way, there's a tendency for these feelings to control us, whereas we've got to bring them into subjection to our understanding and especially to our faith. You know, that 42nd Psalm, the psalmist said, "Why are you cast down?" He's asking himself a question. When you are cast down, you can say, "I don't know what is the matter?" You don't always know the answer. And what you've got to say is what he says. Literally, in a sense, this: never mind why, hope thou in God. You'll yet praise him. And that's what you've got to do. You've got to follow him, trust him, and praise him. You don't have to feel anything to continue to go on in the Christian life in a way which is glorifying to him. The common problem generally an over-concern with feelings. We live in an age of a riot of feelings. Romans 8 said we're led by the Spirit, but some men are not happy unless they feel led. Feeling led is such a problem. They're very unhappy if their feelings are absent or they're not fitting in with what they think is suitable. If they don't feel they've had a good service, they're cast down. They're not happy if they don't hear a few hallelujahs or see people weeping. Well, these things are right and they're good. But you see, if you start trying to produce that, oh, don't we all know something about this? Haven't we seen this in ministers? They feel they're flagging and there's not much authority in the preaching. So they start to work up both their own feelings and the congregation's feeling. Disaster. Recipe for disaster. For unrest. It'll catch up with them. Too great an emphasis is a great danger, an ever-present danger. Truth alone produces real feelings and true emotion. What a confusion there is these days between what you might call natural emotional release in religious services, and people believe it's spiritual worship. They love it, they demand it. They totally fail to differentiate between natural and spiritual. And I'm sorry to say, I do meet quite a number of ministers who I think also don't realize that. Of course, there's got to be a place for feelings and for an expression of feelings in public worship and so on. But I'm told now that the norm of the evangelical service is clapping, choruses, and all these other things. Now, but we're old-fashioned, aren't we, see? I'm digressing, I'm afraid. The point is an over-concern about feelings. And yet, what a need for true emotion. We're short of true emotion. The ministry is full of emotional highs and lows at the best of times. Don't we look forward to Sundays? To the possibility of meeting with the people of God. After a good service, some men, they can't relax. And after a bad service, it's even worse. Somebody once asked the doctor, "What's the answer to a bad Sunday?" And his answer, "Next Sunday." But do you see his point? Don't start worrying about last Sunday. The football managers have got it, haven't they? You can't win them all. There's nothing more depressing than to meet a fellow minister who never has a bad service. You wonder where they get it from, don't you? No, these things are real. We mustn't be afraid to express our feelings. The Apostle Paul wasn't, was he? He talked about his tears and his prayers and his concern and his agonies. Look at that 2 Corinthians 6 that we read. After all the Corinthians said and did to that man, all the criticism, how many could really say, "My heart is open to you, Corinthians, in spite of what you've done to me"? That's true feelings. It helps people when the minister can express it. Indeed, my conclusion is this from observing things over the years. It's only when they see a real sense of love and concern for them that the man has any true and lasting spiritual authority. There is no authority in saying, I am the minister, listen to me. He's got to exert a spiritual authority, and he does that by showing himself to be a loving, caring pastor. And to share his own spiritual struggles is an encouragement to people. It helps them to avoid this danger of putting him on a pedestal and thinking, oh, well, the minister doesn't know anything about this. A minister's got to be himself. Nothing worse than the ministerial format in every sense, expression, manner, voice. There's another danger, of course, that's wearing your heart on your sleeve. Some men, it's all anecdotes about the family and so on. People love it, but it isn't the same thing. There is a kind of matiness that's coming into relationships between ministers and the church that we're not used to, those of us that are older. Everybody's Christian name terms. My old church, the old headmaster, was the church secretary for 50 years. I still call him, I can't but call him by surname, but the young people call him Jack. It absolutely amazes me. Everybody's on Christian name terms. Well, I mean, you might say, well, this is just one of those things, it's happened, but, you know, Spurgeon could maintain that bond of sharing in a very natural way how he felt without any lack of exhibitionism and without familiarity. And one thing is certain, a minister will necessarily be involved in the emotional life of his congregation. If he isn't, he won't be able to exercise any real ministry. The trials and bereavements, in addition to his own personal problems. You see, when you're in a family, a spiritual family, losing one of the church is like losing one of the family. And it affects you. And I've seen it affect ministers. Tremendous stress for them. But the other element in this emotional aspect, and this has come on increasingly in recent years, are the problems that a minister meets in the life of the church, which years ago would have been unthinkable. And they're the effect of the low state of spiritual life in the churches. What do I mean? Well, there are adultery, moral problems, marriage, divorce, remarriage, all these things. They were unheard of years ago, and they're almost the bread and butter of ministerial work these days. The whole question of counselling. You know, counselling at any level is the most exhausting thing. If you go through a surgery and you get a number of people and they start telling you their problems, you're absolutely drained by it. Nothing more drained. And sometimes, you know, I had a woman in this morning, she was telling me in great details about her daughter and how her daughter treats her and so on. And you can't help but be sympathetic, but when you finish you think, well, it's no good giving her any pills, it's not going to affect her daughter. I mean, she understood this. She just wanted to come and talk about it. And people do that, they want that little bit of sympathy. It's part, of course, of the general practitioner's work, but it is extremely exhausting. Well, they're the different emotional pressures, and when they add together, they represent sometimes a total of stress which can be crippling. And the important thing to emphasize is that the Christian is not exempt from these things, nor delivered from them automatically by his faith. And a sufficient total, regardless of the type, will always affect him and sometimes crush him. I don't know how much you've read on psychology and these other things. Obviously, there's a big cross-section of different interests and different backgrounds. But Dr. Gaius Davis, who some of you might know, wrote a book on stress. I've told him it's somewhat misleading title. It is about stress, but it's about much more. It's an excellent book for the man who doesn't want to go too deeply in anything, but it brings up everything and it deals with them in a most sane and sensible way about every aspect of the problems that we've been talking about, modern psychology and so on, the views of men like J. Adams and their counselling and so on. They're all very adequately dealt with. And if you've never read anything like it, and you want something which will give you really some background and framework for these things, have a look at that book by Gaius Davis. To be an effective minister takes emotionally both sensitivity and a resilience. See, in that sense, it's rather like medicine. You've got to take these problems, listen to them, but you've got to have a certain objectivity to it. Otherwise, they will completely crush a man. Well, they're hurriedly the three realms: physical, mental, emotional. And I wonder, I've really got to say some more about the effects of these things on individual men. How do they affect individual men? Well, some men, it just bounces off them. They're well, it doesn't seem to affect them. But a man like Timothy is profoundly affected. Timothy obviously is an anxious man. You're familiar with the whole problems that made him subject to fear and depression, and these things go together. But in the practical part, 1 Timothy 5, he gets this advice. And the advice from Paul that he mentions with regard to his health is such as to show us clearly that these problems were affecting him. And he says, as you know, take a little wine for your stomach's sake. If you were to ask someone who worked next to Timothy in the factory, what do you make of him? He'd say, he's a worry guts. Now that's interesting. Oh, I know it's a rather crude phrase, but you see, what it does is to characterize. Worry goes to the guts. It affects it. Of course, if he comes to see me, I don't use that phrase. I say, you have a nervous dyspepsia. And I go on, if he's an intelligent man, he's able to say, and really, explanation is extremely important here. Many men don't realize the effect on the body, what's going on in the man. The modern expression, you see, of these things, some people think that psychology has come on and invented, or psychology hasn't invented anything. It's given names to things. These things have always been there. There's always been nervous dyspepsias. And the idea that, and some men, you mention the word psychology and the hair goes on end, they think, oh, this is all of the world. It isn't. There's some sound common sense in some of it. And you explain to him, look, this is a psychosomatic disorder, and you go into these things. And of course, he says to you, are you telling me it's all in the mind? And you say, no, it's in your stomach. But what you have to say is this: your stomach is not the culprit, it's the victim. It's inside you. That's the problem with your stomach. And this is extremely important. And Paul's advice is even more interesting because I believe it actually expresses very important principles. You notice what he says. First of all, the negative. Everybody knows the negative's got to be emphasized, don't they? He doesn't tell him to pray about it. He doesn't tell him to read the Bible. He doesn't tell him to go to a healing meeting, nor does he tell him to ignore it. And he doesn't tell him to pull himself together. Now, certain counseling techniques do that, pull yourself together. You're anxious. Well, the Bible says, be anxious for nothing. You're anxious? Well, that's sin. It's about time you confessed it and just stopped it. You can't do that. The essence. And I think Paul understood this because I think he was a similar type of man. So he had sympathy. And what he tells him, you see, is this. In fact, use a bit of common sense, he says. What do the others do? They don't just stick with that water. They take a little wine. And that helps their digestion. Don't be afraid to use the wisdom and experience of men. You know, I find this in so many realms that Christians, they've got to have a Christian doctor or But you see, perhaps I'm fortunate, the psychiatrists that I've met are pretty sensible people. They know the difference between sin and illness. and they usually are able to see through the natural aspects and deal with them very adequately. And of course, when you have a glass of wine, it doesn't affect your stomach. It's a tranquilizer. Alcohol is still the most widely used tranquilizer in the world today. I'm not going to stop with the question of alcohol. I wonder if anybody's disagreeing with my diagnosis. Some people say, Timothy rubbed it on his stomach. It shows you the extent to which prejudice can lead a man. Well, the thing that really I feel vindicates my diagnosis of this nervous dyspepsia is this. He goes on to, he doesn't just leave him with a stomach, he says, thine oft infirmities. When Timothy's come in the surgery, they don't just have dyspepsia. They have, a bit of this, irritable bowel, all these other things. One man once put it perfectly. One Timothy came in, I said, what's the trouble? He said, I'm full of those diseases nobody ever died of. Well, you see, they amuse us, don't they, you see, but they're not funny for the man who's got them. And they're very real. And you do need to remember these things. They came on as a result of the stress of the ministry to this man, Timothy, and they do to any vulnerable person. But what interests me even more about this passage is this. It brings up to me the whole question of conscience. Earlier in the epistle, in the third chapter, you remember there's the marks of the ministry. And one of the things emphasized, he mustn't be a man who lingers over his wine. Now, people of the Timothy disposition, they tend to be over punctilious. They tend to suffer from a sensitive conscience. When Timothy hears, don't linger on your wine, he said, I better not touch it. He needs to be assured, look, don't go to the... I didn't tell you to take a litre, I said a little. You have to say to these men, look, don't be frightened of it. Just act sensibly. Luther once said, didn't he, an oversensitive conscience, he said, it's a very uncomfortable bedfellow. It kicks you in the night, you see, and it wakens you up. You've got a sensitive conscience. And these men are like this. I've always been interested in trying to analyse the doctor's technique when he used to interview men, and they've told me some of the things they said. Very interesting. He approached it in the sort of typical medical way, detached, objective, tell you the symptoms and then ask a few questions, go on with the examination and so on. He's taking it all in. And he's never authoritarian. He's just giving them his experience. And sometimes what he's really doing, the men come out and they say, oh, he helped me greatly. Well, what did he say to you? And when you analyse what he actually said was, you're quite right, just do it. In other words, he gives them reassurance. He gives them what the psychologists call permission. And there's some very timid men, some unsure men, and they got these problems. And he always got out of them he wasn't their conscience, but he got out of them what their view of the matter was, and then told them, that's right, do it. And that's what some men need. They just need that little bit of reassurance, that little bit of permission. See, what we're seeing, if you like, are two factors, temperament and conscience. Tremendously important. Books have been written, some of you will remember Halesby, Lutheran of the 1920s, wrote some interesting books, one on conscience, but one in particular on the place of temperament in the Christian faith. His terminology is old-fashioned. I realise now where the doctor got his from. He used to talk about the sanguine and the choleric and so on. Never heard of it. It's all introverts and extroverts, since the the 30s and so on. But he was describing some real things. And what he shows, and it's interesting, what he does, he takes the individual characteristics, and we're all different, and he shows that some of these characteristics are advantageous in a minister and others are disadvantageous. I mean, take a man like Peter. Well, you do want an incisive man, bold, plunges in. He's a natural leader. Yes, but he acts first and thinks afterwards. And, when you get Peters in the pulpit, they blurt things out, and that offends the congregation. That causes endless trouble. The devil gets in. All sorts of things happen. Why? Because his temperament's controlling him, whereas he should be controlling his temperament. And there's nothing that we need more than a self-knowledge of our temperament and of ourselves. No wonder there's such an emphasis in the scripture on tongues. Not speaking in tongues, there's not much emphasis on that, but controlling the tongue, what you do with the tongue, the natural tongue, in the things that can be understood. The temperament controlling instead of being in subjection. The glory and the possibility of grace surely is this, that a man can be changed and that his temperament can be refined. Look at the Apostle Paul. I should think Saul of Tarsus was an extremely unpleasant man, aggressive, arrogant, conceited. What a change. Grace does that. The Spirit does that. That's the wonderful thing. When grace comes in, know yourself, be yourself, but seek grace to have that self in subjection. One of the biggest tragedies in the ministry is to see some men, they go, as it were, from one church to another. They're always having trouble. Now, you cannot judge that. It may well be that the church in every case is the problem, but sometimes there's just this little thought. Is it that the man has never realized that he has got problems in himself that have not been dealt with and that really are a factor in these problems? Well, I've got quite a bit on diseases of the feelings, including what it is to have anxiety, attacks and these other things. I don't really think that I can possibly bring those up. If you want to stay later, or if men want to go and others want to stay, I'm happy. But I must say a little bit of thing about the particular problems of the older men. The well-known middle period. When you start, you see you're full of energy and drive, this enthusiasm, but then it goes, and it goes through aging, and it's a natural process. And sometimes when nothing much is happening, you get weary, not of the work, but in the work. And you have to come to terms. Half the people that come to see me in the surgery, the older half, I said to them at the end, what you're really saying is, I can't do what I used to do and what I'd like to do, and I want you to do something about it. Now, in the ministry, you've just got to come to terms with that. In so many different ways. Spurgeon put it perfectly once. He was walking down with this other minister. They must have been passing, I should imagine, an old brickyard or something. And of course, Spurgeon, in that sense, never was an old man. They saw an old steamroller. And he said, that's us. We're like that old steamroller. He was always saying, and I say it for your encouragement, there is no time to work for the Lord like when you're young. He was always saying that. Why? When he said, we're like that old steamroller, we have an awful job getting up ahead of steam. And it's true. And this thing discourages men. And they feel guilty of it. They look back on their work and they say, what have we done? The common denominator of so many of the problems of the ministry really is discouragement. That's the biggest problem, discouragement. Men look back, what have I done? No visible results, they're all spiritual. The end of a good ministry, you build up a good church and then it collapses in splits and a man sometimes has to resign. His family's upset, there's no such thing as security, pension, compensation. No wonder men say, like Elijah, I've had enough. And incidentally, I hope it's not the same today, but it used to be, finance, crippling, has brought men that I know right to the very edge. And you see, it isn't, no man worthy of his salt minds if the church hasn't got the money. But there used to be definite attitudes. Keep them poor, it keeps them humble. Now, if you believe that, you believe anything. The last thing it does is to make a man humble. It makes him discouraged. It makes him think, well, that's really what they think of my ministry. And sometimes other men, they're in churches, plenty of money, but nobody gets round to thinking about increasing their salary. And they're too sensitive about it. They don't want to bring up this question of money. They think I'm money grabbing. And they're struggling. Some of them are having to cash their policies in. I've known this. Oh, I hope it's not universal. You've got to teach the people this, because it's a terrible thing. Well, look, I'm going to leave the subject of depression and anxiety, tremendously important. Just say this one thing about depression. There's nothing more important than to realise this thing. Spurgeon knew it. He used to describe it wonderfully. He said it's like the cloud that comes over. You don't know where it comes from, and of course there was no treatment. He used to say, I'm waiting for the cloud to go. Melancholia. The Puritans described it in all their pastoral teachings very fully. But there's treatment for it, and it's misdiagnosed, it's underdiagnosed by doctors, and it's our bread and butter. But sometimes the man comes, he's got a host of physical symptoms, can't think. Spurgeon used to say, when he was in this state, it used to take him all day to do what he could do in half an hour. The mind is dull. There's a great difference, you see, between, the spiritual depression that Lloyd Jones described in that wonderful book of his, and this medical depression, this melancholia. It's caused men to commit suicide. And these days, people come along, oh, you're taking tablets, stop them. You want to come and we'll cast out the demons and so on. And men have finished up committing suicide because of this lack of appreciation. It often presents as physical symptoms. I can't go into the medical aspects fully tonight. But, they can't sleep, they wake early, they can't get going, there's no sparkle. Everybody notices it. And if he's a quiet man, sometimes the man doesn't tell it, and nobody does notice. And it's so sad. I've had to encourage many a minister, look, get hold of those, keep on them. Keep on an adequate dose. You may need to keep on for a long time. These things often come insidiously. We know that they're going to go. Depression has these hollows, and then they come out. Don't miss it. It's tremendously important. But finally, I've got to say just this one thing, of course, that it's a man's spirit which is the big thing that makes a difference to his health and his ministry. Sir William Osler, famous physician at Barts, used to say this to his men: cultivate equanimity. Equanimity means that calmness, that almost objective detachment which enables a doctor, for example, when you go to see him, to think, well, he's listening to me, he's interested in me, he's taking in what I'm saying. Now, we don't want to cultivate that. We don't want that image. We want the reality. What Cowper called the calm and heavenly frame. It's tremendous. It's the thing which draws and attracts. It's the thing that is a quality of heart and mind that comes through discipline and control of the whole personality. It's a wonderful thing. The ultimate answer to all these things is spiritual. We've got to see that. We know that. Just to compare our problems with the apostle. When you read, that's why I read that 2 Corinthians 6. When you saw what that man went through, you think, what are we talking about? We think we've got problems, and we look at what the apostle went through. They're not worthy to be compared. Yet the writer of the Hebrews says, if you don't consider Christ and the hostility that he endured, you will get weary and discouraged in your souls. It's inevitable. And he says in 2 Corinthians 4, we do not lose heart. Why? Well, because of faith. Faith is the only thing that can help you to triumph over these things. People say to me, do you believe in miracles? I say the miracle that I've seen is how some men go on in the Christian faith when all these things have happened to them, the disasters in the church, the way the church treats them. It's amazing how they're able to go on. The great and the last word is with Jeremiah Burroughs, isn't it? The rare jewel of Christian contentment. To be able to go on, not just putting up with it, but actually contented with it. Learning that contentment. Paul learnt it, how to be exalted. It's very difficult to handle pride, isn't it? Especially when you begin to go up. How to be abased. Spurgeon has a wonderful sermon on humility. He says, you've got sometimes to learn what it is to be a doormat for Christ. And many men have been in the ministry, literally doormats. But they say, the gospel is so glorious, and the privilege of being a preacher of it so amazing to me, that God has called me. These things are as nothing. That was the Apostle Paul's attitude, wasn't it? They're nothing, he said, when I compare the glory of the gospel and the privilege of being a preacher. I can put up with them all. He realized these things are part of the work. I can do all things through Christ, who continues to infuse that strength into me. I've got to finish with a quotation from Spurgeon. Just listen to this. Our friend Mr. Murray sent me this. The time was revival time. The time was when our ministers thought that preaching twice a Sunday was the hardest work amidst a man could be exposed. I never believed in the hard work of preaching yet. And yet, in his book he says, I'm exhausted. But when the Lord comes, as it were, with healing in his wings, the thing changes. We find ourselves able to preach 10 or 12 times a week. We find we're the stronger for it. That our ministers, they used to think, were hardly done by. They ought to be pampered and laid up in velvet and brought out to do a little bit of work occasionally and then pitted. I don't hear anything of that nowadays. I meet my brethren in the ministry. They preach day after day, not half so fatigued as they were. I saw a brother minister this week who'd been having meetings in his church every day, and the people were so earnest, they kept him up from 6 o'clock in the evening till 2 in the morning. Oh, said one of the members, our minister will kill himself. Not he, said I. That's the kind of work that'll kill no man. It's preaching to a sleepy congregation that kills good ministers. Isn't it the truth, though? So when I saw him, that's this minister, his eyes were sparkling. And I said to him, brother, you don't look like a man who's being killed. Killed, he said? I'm living twice as much as I did before. I was never so happy, never so hearty, never so well. I sometimes lack my rest and want my sleep when they keep me up late and so on. But it doesn't hurt me. I should like to die of such a disease, the disease of being so greatly blessed. That's it. That's the ministry. That is when God comes. Oh, he hasn't come in revival, has he, for a long time, since that 1860 event, in a sense, in a great national way. But he does come sometimes to encourage us, doesn't he? It's a day of small things. But we are not alone. He is with us. And we must keep on. And we must keep on praying. And we must keep on glorying in the gospel and in the Lord Jesus Christ. And that will keep us in real health. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Magazine Mondays on the Banner podcast. To find out more about the Banner of Truth Trust, go to banneroftruth.org.